All right, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to section number 1 of conic sections. This is classifying conic sections. Now, the way I like to start off this lesson is by going back to a process that many students have, been taught in Algebra 2, or we went over at least in this course, which is completing the square. And what I do is I just kind of start off with the quadratic equation and identifying the vertex by rewriting the equation from standard form to vertex form via completing the square. And I kind of label them as like levels, because like the first problem is very simple, very easy. You don't actually need to complete the square at all. You can just, factor it. And then we kind of work through our completing the square. And these are kind of like your base levels here, level 1 and level 2. And then we start getting a little bit more difficult, like especially when we have a number in front of our x squared. Therefore, we have to factor it out, or at least the way that I like to teach it in this case is factoring that number out to be able to write it in vertex form. So therefore, we can identify the vertex. And then we kind of move into level 5 and level 6 is where when we're doing our b divided by 2, it doesn't divide evenly and we have fractions. Now, level 1 through 6 are all different levels that we will experience inside of this chapter. So that's why I want to, kind of expose students to them now so we can kind of see how this completing the square is going to, work when we're dealing with very basic equations as well as ones that might not be as nice, like this level 6, where it just looks like it's a lot of fractions. It kind of looks a little overwhelming. So I want to start with that practice now as we start to identify these equations for our conic sections. Now, we're going to use completing the square kind of like how we did for quadratics, because in quadratics, when we complete the square, we do that to convert it from standard form as well as to vertex form. Well, for conic sections, we're going to use completing the square to convert from general form to our standard forms. So our standard form for our parabola is going to look very similar to a quadratic, but you can see it's a little bit different here. And we'll talk about this a little bit more in depth as we get into the section for each of these chapters. But the first one, I just want you to see the parabola. We have a horizontal or a vertical parabola. So you can see where x is squared or when we're going to have y squared. We're also going to investigate the circle, which we are familiar with as well. And you can see that there are now two quantities that are squared in this case. So sometimes we'll be completing the square twice. And that's going to be the true for the circle as well as the ellipse, which is very similar to the circle equation. I want you to see, though, we added some new variables here, a and b, and we'll talk about those again as we investigate the ellipse a little bit further. And then we'll look at the hyperbola, which is very similar to the ellipse. You just notice that the two quantities are being subtracted instead of being added. And again, we have that a and the b, and we have our two quantities squared. Now, these are all what we call the standard form of our conic sections, and we will be using completing the square to classify them, to identify what is the correct equation for your conic section. But we're also going to investigate the conic sections or classify them based on their general form. So we don't always have to go ahead and complete the square if our only goal was just to classify them. So we'll go ahead and look at how to classify your conic sections a little bit deeper by just using their general form. Now, that is kind of just the introduction here for our conic sections. Please go ahead and download and review the notes for this section. Then go ahead and get started into the practice for your practice and your processes. And then it'll time to go ahead and take your quiz. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Cheers.